to try and stay on time. The next panel, or this panel, considers Buddhism as a source for socially engaged art practice or social practice. In the late 1970s, the concept of engaged Buddhism had a significant impact on artists concerned with social and civil rights issues. Buddhism has continued to inform approaches to social practice, informing ideas related to the role of the artist in society, concepts of activism, and notions of social change. This panel explores how artists draw on Buddhist concepts and methods to situate new kinds of social relations, considering the relationship between art and service. And our moderator this afternoon is Marcus Boon. Marcus is a writer and professor of English at York University in Toronto, who also writes about music for the avant-garde music magazine The Wire. He recently co-edited a collection of writings on practice in contemporary art with Gabrielle Levine as part of the well-known Documents of Contemporary Art series published by the Whitechapel Gallery and MIT Press. Marcus is working on a new edition of William Burroughs and Brian Geison's The Third Mind with David Schneiderman, and that's University of Minnesota Press, and it's forthcoming. And among his various publications, Marcus has edited a volume of poems by the Buddhist poet Don Giorno, and is co-author with Timothy Morton and Eric Kasdan of a book of essays titled Nothing, 3 Inquiries into Buddhism. So thank you, Marcus.
Hi, everybody. I'm just thinking that every time I speak in public, it's okay. I say this Tara mantra before I speak. And I never tell anyone that I do that. So I'm sharing my Buddhist secret with you. Yeah. I also want to say for myself, I guess I just dedicate my remarks to my friend John Giorno, who Hama just mentioned, and who died about a week ago. And John was a great American Buddhist poet, artist, kind of queer activist as well. And, going back to the Vietnam War and his activities with Abbie Hoffman, then he had something called the AIDS Treatment Project in the 80s and 90s, where basically he committed to treating strangers, in other words, anyone he met who had AIDS, who needed money or love, that he would just give it to them. And so he collected money from different sources and then kind of without discrimination would just give whatever it was that they wanted that he was able to give them. And that was the project. And when I first started getting into Buddhism, and I was excited to meet Buddhist artists and poets, and I would interview them, and he was one of the first I interviewed. And he basically refused to admit that he was a Buddhist poet. He would just say, I'm a Buddhist, and I'm a poet. And I believe in compartmentalization. In other words, I don't want the two things to mix, even though like half of his poems are called things like Guru Rinpoche. And that completely stumped me. It was not what I was expecting at all. So I approached with trepidation, talking about Buddhism and art. But here we are. So I'm going to introduce our 3 panelists. First of all, Oliver Kellhammer. So Oliver is an ecological artist, educator, activist and writer. Through his botanical interventions and public art projects, he seeks to demonstrate nature's surprising ability to recover from damage. His work facilitates the processes of environmental regeneration by engaging the botanical and socio-political underpinnings of the landscape and calling to mind a socially engaged Buddhism. It continues to evolve and has taken various forms, such as small-scale urban ecoforestry, inner-city community agriculture, and the restoration of eroded railway ravines. I'm not going to read the full printed bio because you can do that yourselves. So Susan Stewart is a social practice artist and educator who lives in Vancouver, BC. Her early work was with the queer collective Kiss and Tell, whose provocative productions were exhibited and performed locally and internationally. Her work continues to address relational and political aspects of the social body, including social, ecological sustainability within the context of both Buddhism and cultural crisis. Projects include documenting the Arctic, addressing human culpability in catastrophic ice loss, a theme also explored in the immersive video installation Change Without Notice. Present work involves image explorations of Buddhist pilgrimage sites in Asia and North America, focusing on the human seeking of the sacred in a time of radical disconnection. Finally, Mali Wu. So Mali is a leader in promoting socially engaged art in Taiwan. Since the 1990s, she has produced a series of highly influential projects, among which Art as Environment, a cultural action at the Plum Tree Creek, jointly produced with Bamboo Curtain Studio, won the Taishan Arts Award in 2013, the most prestigious art prize in Taiwan. Parallel to her practice, she led the translation of two important texts, Suzanne Lacey's Mapping the Terrain, New Genre Public Art, and Grant Kester's Conversation Pieces, Community and Communication in Modern Art, into Chinese. In 2007, she organized the landmark conference Art in the Public Sphere, Working in Community, and later edited a volume of the same title to unite local practitioners, theorists, and officials. So basically, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak briefly about connection between Buddhism, art, and social engagement.
Hi, everyone. So we prepared a little bit beforehand. We had a very interesting conversation in the coffee shop, and we realized that we were all really interested in each other's work. So I'm hoping we have lots of time for the toing and froing. My background, I will start with an anecdote from very early childhood. So imagine I'm in a sandbox in the back of a sixplex apartment in southern Ontario near Toronto. And my father worked in a styrofoam factory, a styrene factory, so he worked night shift. So he was kind of the superintendent of this apartment. And he made us a sandbox, me and the other little ruffians who were living there. And our favorite thing to do, and I might have been like 3, was we had little plastic shovels, and we dug down into the sand, past all the cat droppings and everything, and then we would get to where there was earthworms. And our favorite thing to do would be to pick up the earthworms and cut them in half with our shovels and watch them wiggle. And we did this like every day. It was kind of like a weird, demonic child torture practice. So one day my father came out of the building, and he looked at me, and he looked at the worms wiggling in my little plastic bucket, and he started sobbing. Now, he was not really sobbing, but I was too young and naive to understand that. But he was going, "Ooh, I'm in pain. I hurt so much. You cut me in half and now I hurt. And then I burst into for real tears. And that has stayed with me as a sort of epiphanic moment of when I first realized that there was suffering in the world and that I could be responsible for the suffering of other beings who I didn't really understand, had suffering. So this was like a sort of moment. And ever since then, I've been trying to do work that somehow addresses the sort of subjectivity of the non-human, and also to try to reduce suffering in some way in the world as best I can. And the other topic that I was very moved by was where do I end and the worm begin, right? Like, what is the sort of line between myself and other? And so this is troubling me as an artist for, ever since I got going. And I eventually met my wife, who's a Zen Buddhist priest and novelist, Ruth Ozeki, who some of you have known. I was telling her all these things. I've been reading Bruno Latour or Donna Haraway, and going on about multi-species muddles and stuff. And she says, "We do that. The Buddhists have known this for 2,000 years. What are you talking about? Why is this new, right?" So we were constantly having this kind of conversation between art theory, my own kind of, mental torture about trying to do good in the world, and Zen Buddhism. So there's been remarkable congruences that I'm continuously discovering, 25 years after having gotten together with Ruth. So that's something that's sort of an ongoing thread in the practice. And then there's this notion of ephemerality. So much of our practice as social practitioners is about maybe starting something, working with communities, working with ecosystems, working with complicated situations, and then removing ourselves. I think that's kind of a sort of fundamental part of it. So we're sort of non-monumental. We work away from this notion of monuments and try to decide, what can I not do? Right? That's a very important kind of question to ask yourself as an artist. We're so motivated by productivity. We sort of internalized, kind of Fordian nature or notions of production. But to actually stand back and go, what can I not do? When is it time to let the intervention start to have its own life, and the people and ecosystems that we have somehow maybe affected or helped start to take care of themselves and evolve beyond us as the artist. And the artist can then go away and be forgotten about. So I think it's very important, certainly in my practice, is to sort of step back and go, this is fine. I don't need to do anything anymore. And the older I get, the less I want to do. So my ambition is to, do more and more of less and less, right? So it's kind of laziness, but it's also a kind of way of being able to do other things that you then remove yourself from. So that's been an ongoing theme. These are like these little sort of floating motes of ideas that hopefully we can build on. And the idea of not making work that's about something, but being something. So my work's not about the environment, it is the environment. And then the environment, after a while, doesn't necessarily need me anymore. So that's maybe the difference between this kind of practice and other practices. I hope I haven't gone on for too long. Okay.
I can use this.
Oh, you want to use that one? Okay.
Yeah. Hi. I really appreciate that Hama invited me to be here, because when I got the invitation, I thought, I am not a practicing Buddhist, but the Buddhism is actually embedded in the whole culture and in our daily life, and what could I contribute to? But during these days, through different panels, I learned a lot, and it also reminds me of the paths I have gone through, and I thank you that very much. And first of all, I would like to share is about my learning process on art. I have my art study at the beginning. It was in Vienna, so it's from the 1980, and I stayed there for 1.5 years, and then I went to Düsseldorf, Kunstakademie, so Art Academy in Düsseldorf. So I stayed there until 86. So I was struggling a lot because I came from totally different culture. I haven't learned art in Taiwan, but I was very interested in theater. So I thought I would love to learn something about theater, and that's why I went to Vienna. But when I was there, that was about the time when the action art was so popular in Vienna, and there are some iconic figure like Hama, etc. All those male artists who has really very strong ego to express themselves. And I found it so difficult for me because I am not this kind of person. Again, so it's really helped me to think of the cultural differences. So I realized that I was trying to learn art in the Western world, but the art I was confronting is actually from totally different cultural background, because I came from a world where, as I said, Buddhism or Taoism was really embedded in our daily life. So we were taught not to have ego, or not to be really so egocentric. So I really had difficulties in learning art in the Western world, because I realized that art is actually about individualism, and art is really about express your own ego. But then when I was in Düsseldorf, it was also a kind of very interesting period, because there was Fluxus and also the Group Zero. My professor was Günther Uecke, whose work is really very meditative. And also at the time, there were a lot of Fluxus events in the academy. So I began to encounter a kind of art which is really very different from the art I have experienced in Vienna. And then I began to read those texts by those artists, and I realized that they were very much influenced by Buddhism or Taoism, and it really helped me to find the path or the way how I can and use art to express myself. So I would say this is a very interesting experience, because here I heard so many from many of you who is living here in Western world, but talking about Buddhism, while I myself come from the Asian world, where the Buddhism or Taoism is really embedded in daily life, although it could be also kind of ideology, but I hardly think of that. So I found that I actually learning to understand more about Zen or Buddhism or Taoism actually is from the Western art. I mean, artists like Frusus. Yeah, I think that's really have a lot of impact in my art practices. And especially maybe, the social sculpture is a term came from Joseph Beuys, who was also teaching in Düsseldorf Kunstakademie. And in '86, when I went back to Taiwan, that was the time when Taiwan has a lot of political movements happening. And the work I have done in Düsseldorf during my study time, it's also quite meditative and very playfulness. So I would say I was trying to use the daily material and to express the playfulness, and also, it's very much like a very meditative work. But when I went back to Taiwan, I was confronting a tension in our society. And then again, I was trying to ask myself how art can deal with that. So that's how the social sculptures, this term came to my mind, and I was trying to understand the relationship between art and society. So in year 2000, when I was invited to work with a group of women from community, and I was conducting a workshop with them, and most of them had non-art education. But at the very beginning, when I was doing workshop with them, they were saying, they didn't know how to do art. But then I say, okay, why not just begin with drawing a line and to express yourself through just a simple line. It could be a straight line or a broken line or a curved line, whatever you wanted. And after this exercise, everyone became really an artist. So they could really express themselves very well through a simple line. And this experience was really very inspiring to me. Somehow I felt that I learned what art means to us, again, through this very simple exercise. And so through these experiences, I also try to think what kind of art education we had, because most of the art education in Taiwan especially, we are really focusing on producing artists instead of to help people understand art or to appreciate art by yourself. So that's how I begin to think maybe we should focus on the audience. I was asking myself, who is your audience, and whom are you addressing to? Through art. So through this kind of conversation or dialogues inside myself, I began to work more and more with the general public, and then somehow it develops into a kind of so-called socially engaged art. And I really learned a lot from this kind of experiences, because I realized that art is not about artist, she or herself, but it's more about an aesthetical experiences, and through this process that we all share and understand and appreciate it. And this is the reason why I am very much interested in using art as a tool to address different issues that I am interested in. For example, as I said, when I went back to Taiwan, we had quite strong political movements which deal with there were many issues, not just about the political hierarchy, but also very much about the gender issue, environmental issue, and labor issue, etc. There were many issues happening at the same time. So I began to use art to address the issue on social inequality. And through those experiences, I found that I've somehow there's a new art form, which later I realized that it's called so-called new genre public art. And also because of that, I began to read some theories or some books, like from America, as just mentioned, the book edited by Susan Lacy or written by Grant Castor, etc. And also later on, I realized there's an aesthetic called relational aesthetic by Boon, etc. So I think through these experiences, I am toward a very different intention of making art, or bringing a different understanding of so-called art education, and which is not so much about our ego, or not so much about egocentric, but it's really about sharing, communicating, and doing art through the process. So I think I just share here, and later if anything comes to my mind, I will say again. Thank you.
Hello. It's so nice to be here with all of you. This has been a remarkable convening, and thank you to the organizers. It's very beautiful. I really didn't know what I was going to say today, and I woke up at 2:30 last night pondering, and I think I have like 5 minutes. So I think what I want to talk about, because there are a few things we could talk about, is how Buddhism absolutely ruined my art career. And why, and how that happened. So, I've been an artist for at least 45 years, long time. And, I'm in the same bracket as these three. And, when I came, I was a very ambitious young artist and full of steam. And when I came out of art school, I was ready to just like rock and roll it. And I hit barriers immediately outside the gate. I hit the barrier of sexism, I hit the barrier of homophobia, and I hit the barrier of class. And these were huge obstacles. So my first 20 years of my career were spent battling systems. I found like-minded friends, artists, and together we, had pitch battles in these three areas. Women's liberation, queer liberation, and class. And so it was an exhilarating time, but all it ended up doing is making me more angry. And I was already kind of angry anyway, but I became extremely angry, and to the point where things became very meaningless for me. And, I couldn't make sense of the world. I couldn't make sense of injustice. I found, I know a lot of social practice artists, and I think one thing that we all have, all of us, is we have a finely attenuated intolerance for injustice. And I've seen that in all of my social practice friends and colleagues. And that is always, and it seems like the switch goes on. It's always on in children, but in adults it seems something happens. But when the switch is on for me and my friends, it never goes off. It's always there, an irritation. So I was also very curious about spirituality, and I knew that I had this big lack of something, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. So anyway, 20 years in, I'm really angry. I'm kind of a spiritual seeker. I'm suffering a lot, and I'm seeing a lot of suffering in the world, and I can't make sense of any of it. So I found Buddhism, you could say, or Buddhism found me. I don't know how this works exactly. But anyway, Buddhism and I made a connection. And I found my perfect teacher, and I found the perfect lineage, which was the Vajrayana Tibetan lineage. And it was almost immediately, I just decided to go for it. So I turned over everything and I said, well, I'm going to just look into this Buddha Dharma because, I've hit a wall anyway, so why not? So I went in 100%. And I spent the next 10 or 15 years studying Buddhism intensively. And I had a very good guide, fortunately. And so it moved things along. And I started practicing also. Although I'm not a great practitioner, I'm much more, like a lot of Westerners, I'm more intellectually oriented. But anyway, so I started at the beginning. And, when I heard the first teaching of the Buddha, I was totally hooked. Because the first teaching of the Buddha were the Four Noble Truths, and the first truth is the truth of suffering. Yeah, I can relate to that. Second Noble Truth is the cause of suffering. I didn't understand that one. So I had to spend several years trying to figure out those teachings, because they're good, but they're difficult. Third Noble Truth is another good one. It's nirvana, peace, liberation, freedom is possible. Excellent news. And then the fourth Noble Truth is the path or the methodology to discover that. Not such good news for someone like me. So it was a 20-year investigation, and I tried to divorce Art right at the beginning. I said, "You and I, Art, we're kind of finished, so I want a divorce." And Art said, "No, not going to happen. I'm sticking with you." So I said, "Okay, fine, but I'm not going to pay any attention to you for a long time." And so I didn't for about 6 years or so. Art and I tried to push it away. It wouldn't. It was sticking, but it was there. But I was, and because why? So when you start studying Dharma and you start in the beginning, the whole first wheel of Dharma, the foundational teachings, are about teaching you how not to cling to this thing called self and ego, right? And, we were clinging like this, so one finger at a time, they tear off, until your clinging kind of lessens a little bit. You have to start with yourself in Buddhism. So, I did that for quite a long time. And, I was meditating and practicing on my own non-existence of myself, non-existence of my ego. So, a contradiction starts popping up. So how can you be, I'm empty, I have no ego, I have no self. How can that make it a truly existent artwork? There's a contradiction there, because my understanding of art up to that point was that it was kind of like a sign of self at that point in your life. So you're throwing out all these signs. In my case, I was an angry activist, so my signs were very political, but they were signs of self, really, in my mind. So I was having this conflict, this contradictory conflict of selflessness, egolessness, emptiness, and then art, which is demanding presence, demanding production, demanding action, demanding something of me. So when I was in the foundational study, I couldn't deal with that at all. When I moved on to the Mahayana 10 years later, thankfully I got that far, when you get to that space, if you open up a little bit of emptiness in yourself, and for me it was probably just a crack, what starts to happen is that you get more in touch with your heart again, right? And, you know, when you're an angry activist, that's the first thing that goes, really. At least in my case it was. You know, I couldn't feel anymore. You know, I got very numb. So the practice and the study of the Buddha Dharma opens up the heart a little bit. So what does that mean? It means that you start thinking about other people again, you know, and start thinking about engaging with the world again. But of course, I've destroyed everything by now, and I have no definition for art anymore. I completely don't understand what art is at all at this point, or why anyone would do it. That was my John Cage period, by the way, for you Cagians. I was showing 433 in all my creative process classes, and my mantra I chanted over and again, I have nothing to say and I'm saying it. I've got nothing to say and I'm saying it. And that was me in my, you know, for like 5 years. I've got nothing to say and I'm saying it. And I'm not producing anything. So I'm a total fraud as an art teacher. So, you know, this is all happening. And then, but Mahayana came along, thankfully. And in Mahayana, you start with the Heart Sutra, which we've been introduced to a couple of times in these couple of days here. And the Heart Sutra is about emptiness, but it's about, you know, not this, not this, not this, not this, but something replaces all of that not. And that's a heart that's kind of shining, bright, awake, and caring deeply about other beings. So this is good news for somebody. You know, that was my impulse early on, but I was very confused. So I'm a little bit less confused. So I'm thinking to myself, well, art, let's try again. Let's see if we can do something here. But honestly, I can't make a thing. I can't make anything that's a thing. So what I did for the next 10 years was what I would call art that doesn't even look like art. I don't think it was even readable to people. It was incoherent, illegible as art. But for me, I felt like I was entering back into art. And social practice, which I've always felt aligned with, was coming on stream as a discourse at this point. So that was really helpful. And I started reading a lot of social practice material. I identified, I like Molly and Oliver. My roots are in Fluxus and all of that, happenings, performance art. So I had been introduced to the lineage of social practice. That is the lineage in some respects. And so, I did this for about 10 years, so I took on a couple of projects that were invisible, but for me they were art projects, so I won't go into the details. One was an administrative job at an art school for 7 years, and the other was a deep ecology of farming, urban ecologies. And so I won't give details about that, but those were my two projects, and for me they were social practice art projects, but they couldn't be read by the culture as that necessarily. So now I'm a Vajrayana Buddhist student, so I don't know what that means exactly, but and I think I've talked enough probably at this point. That's at least 7 minutes, right? I got the hook? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm trying to think where's the best way to go with this. I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on collaboration. Like, in different ways, each of you is concerned with interdependence and of having some kind of art practice that emerges out of interdependence and what it means to collaborate, and just how you think about that, or how you think Buddhism maybe changes what the terms of collaboration actually are, especially with socially engaged art.
So that's a very interesting question, because there's human collaborators. I mean, I continue to work with mostly other people. I'm working with people from NYU now in a Dear Climate collective, and we are looking at the sort of psychosocial effects of climate change. And the whole really is greater than the sum of its parts. I mean, like none of us, like this thing that happens is so far beyond any of us as individuals, and that's what makes it interesting and fun. And my early work was all collaborative with a painter called Janice Boley, who was very influential in my early work. But then the non-human collaborators also, working with ecosystems, the fact that thinking of agency as an artist, I mean, you have this idea, right? But really, everything has ideas, and so lately I've been working a lot with insects who have their own ideas, and I think in the scroll of images, there's a image of a styrofoam cup, which goes back to my father's sad life because he got cancer from working in styrofoam factories, and this idea of this material that sort of has permeated my life that I'm now kind of dealing with long after he's gone. So this material is essentially a collaborator, even though it's sort of a noxious plastic material, but I'm actually feeding it to insects, which are creating these random absences of material. So you have pieces of garbage that are full of holes that I now send to art galleries, and my name is on these pieces of garbage as the artist, but I didn't really do them. There was 10,000 nameless mealworms who are responsible. I mean, I put it in the FedEx box, right? So I did something, but and so I had this idea. Okay, but that's a valid collaboration too. And then when you're working with communities, also you have a sense of what you may want to do. And that some of that may continue through the collaboration, but the sort of serendipitous quality of all of the other agencies is really what makes the work much more interesting, when you can sort of stand back from it and go, I didn't know that was going to happen. That's totally wild. And so sort of taking the self out of it and sort of acting more as a kind of irritant, or perhaps a good irritant, like a sort of homeopathic agent or a sort of germ around which things can form. So that can be a type of collaboration as well. So it really depends on the sort of meta narrative or the micro narrative, and I'm really interested. I don't like working by myself. I guess the bottom line is the less of me in the work, the better. But somebody has to start something sometimes. So, yeah. Did you want to? Okay.
I work in many different ways. It depends on the subject. So as I just mentioned, actually in the 90s, most of my work is very political. It's really about social political art, but done by myself. But in 97, when I began to develop a project which is about the stories of the women from the textile factory, I began to ask myself, what does the art mean? Because when I produce a work with people's story, I achieved something, but what does this artwork means to them? I started to question myself, and I think it's not just about the ethical problem, but also because it's also a question of what does the art means, or what does an art exhibition means, especially to those people who are related to the work. So I started to find the way that the work bring not just some satisfaction to myself, but also have some impact to other people. So I would call my work, most of my works is about art intervention. So it means when I begin to do something, there's always an issue. But it's all about social, political, or environmental issue. But if I would like to do something which have really also impact on other people, not just on myself, then I really need to find a way to engage the other people so that the problem that I try to address could be more aware also by the other people, or try to bring possible changes to the reality. So I call this as a collaboration, but it not necessarily means that we work together. So I would say that I just try to initiate something so that people can join in if they want. So in this way, we collaborate together, and I think whoever participate in the project, I mean, this is also their work, not just my work. So in this way, we really collaborate with each other.
So yes, I love collaboration, and I would say 75% of my practice has been collaborative. I seek it out when I can. I like working with other minds because, especially if we're dealing with complex or difficult issues, questions, I find that working with collaborators, you get very unexpected results that are much more full and much more actually interesting for the viewer, on the one hand. And the other thing I've tried to do in my career is empower subjectivity. So I'm a photographer, and I've done projects where I've worked with people where they have been the subject in either in a documentary film or in a photo series of my work. And I really try to always, it's difficult, but make the power as equal as possible, and honor the subject's side of things. And actually, from my perspective, that's more important when I'm working with people. I'm much more interested in people's side of things than my own. I'm really bored of myself. So, it's really, collaboration for me is very necessary, I would say, most of the time. The other 75% of my practice, and it's become, and I didn't quite finish my story there, I'm really trying to practice presence now in a new way. And that's why I love the title of this conference so much, The Present Moment. I'm trying to be an artist who is present. There's something called the artist is present. That's Marina. They're like that, right? The artist is present. I can't say that that's true of me, but it's an aspiration to be present.
Maybe I'll ask one quick last question, and then we'll open it up. I wasn't going to ask this, but the word resistance came into my mind. And I was just thinking, especially this morning, like when I meditate, unfortunately, I'm not an enlightened being. And if I ask myself why I am not an enlightened being, at some level within myself, there is a resistance to being enlightened. And when I look politically at the world we inhabit, and I ask myself why we are not liberated politically and why we don't inhabit a kind of egalitarian world, at some level resistance manifests there. And so I just kind of wonder in general what the role of resistance actually is in your practice as artists, and how you work with the fact that often stuff doesn't change, or we don't change, or the way reality in its illusory form persists. Whatever you like. Yeah, sure.
You are on a roll. So this is a word that I think about a lot. My own resistance to pretty much everything that involves hard work. But there's a larger theme that a lot of the work that I like the most and try to do is has some sort of emancipatory program, right? So the idea that things are not what they might be. There's suffering, and there's also a voice issue, as you pointed out. This issue of subjectivity, right? How can we as artists help intersubjectivity to evolve, like to allow space for voices that aren't being heard, and those could be non-human voices. And one of the problems in the sort of present, sort of historical moment, and this is, going back to the beginning of our careers, but sort of modernism, late modernism, is this the sort of the object of the market, capitalism. There's increasingly the figure ground relationship between what is the market and what is not the market is harder and harder to discern. So that our work, that I'm seeing in common, and certainly what I've tried to focus on throughout most of my career is to create the adjacent possible, right? So the idea that there's an outside to the market system. There's places like community gardens and, crazy permaculture projects that where the market is not, it doesn't apply. It's like Glinda the Good Witch coming down and going, "You have no power here," and so not that I'm Glinda the Good Witch, but somebody has to do. Well, actually, I do a pretty good Glinda, but there has to be an alternative to the sort of hegemony of the market, not just the oppressive nature of the market, but also it's kind of monoculture, that everything is a transaction according to its exchange value, and so in terms of intersubjectivity, to create subjectivities outside of the market aesthetic, I think is a very vital part of my practice and a lot of social practice people. So the resistance to the market monoculture, the resistance to the kind of power relationships that have defined life since we were born is a key motivator. So that's where the resistance comes in.
Yeah, I agree that art is very much about resistance, because art help things unheard to be heard. So as I said, I would call most of my projects as art intervention. So intervention means, there's something that you want to intervene, and so that it could be somehow different, although maybe the world doesn't change that so quick. But to bring this awareness of the problematic, I think it's very important. And also, I agree what Olivia was saying. I think the role of art in the society nowadays seems not so idealistic to me, because it's too much about the commodity, or too much about using art as a kind of tool for bringing the so-called creative industry, etc. But I think art should be something really about how to bring the beauty into life, but the beauty is not as a formalist idea, but it's really about how we feel good, or really about bringing positive energies into life. That's what I thought about. Yeah.
I don't have a lot to add. I agree with everyone has just said, but I'm pondering this notion of resistance, and from a Dharma practice perspective, really it's about letting go. of resistance, ultimately speaking, letting go. And what we're talking about here for me, is working with my own concepts of resistance and my own concepts of other, my own biases, that is forcing a duality of me and them or this and that, and trying to actually bridge that space. And the only place I have any control at all is in my own mind, really. I can't control others, but I can control my relationship to others from my side, right? So, I've heard it said, I have no idea what enlightenment is either, I haven't got a clue, but I've heard it said that the great Mahasiddhas experienced something called equality, and that they treat all beings as equal without any bias whatsoever. And I think I have that aspiration as well. And I've been a political activist. I understand resisting systems, right? I'm still unlike that. It can get me going easily. But from a personal, dharmic, meditative space, and an aspiration to become enlightened at some point in some lifetime, I think that the practice there is to really look at our own minds and what resistances are showing up, and really look at those quite directly and try to understand them. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so we have, 20, 25 minutes. So are there questions from the floor? Chrisanne?
Thank you, guys. I love this panel. Anyway, so yesterday I spoke about my teacher, Gelek Rinpoche, and of course my work with Jetsuma Tenzin Palmo. And one of the observations I have had with both of them is they were surrounded by artists, musicians, writers. Jetsuma's, her guru was an artist, Komto Rinpoche, the first, and there are Shogo Rinpoche, so very interesting artists within that community. But Gelek Rinpoche was very close to Allen Ginsberg. His students include Philip Glass and numerous other people. And during one teaching, which was very Rinpoche, we was talking about dedication. You dedicate the merit and all that. And he looked at the Sangha and he said, you can dedicate your art practice. So in the dedication, you dedicate the work that you do to benefit all sentient beings, or to, whether you like them or not, And so I was wondering how that thought of dedicating your work, or if you've ever done that, I'm curious.
Let's do the same order.
I think one of the reasons he said that was so that we don't get too obsessed with the little ego running around in our heart.
Yes. I think that's really the main thing, is like, why do you do these things, right? Like, why, of all the things you could do in life, it's a pretty nuts thing to be an artist. Like there's really no, given the sort of commercial environment that we live in, of all the choices, all of us who are like educators, like, how am I going to make a living at this, Professor Kellhammer? And it's like, oh my God, don't ask me. I barely make a living myself, teaching you guys. But anyhow, but the question is why, right? And you dedicate yourself, and I think reducing suffering and also to deepening understanding is also the curiosity. Like, what would it be like to know deeper levels of intersubjectivity, but just a deeper immersion in being, right? And being is really it. And the more you think about things and make work, the deeper you get. So it's a more present kind of cognitive state, right? So and that's a really hard sell with people's parents, right? It's like you can't like monetize that. But I think, you know, for me that really is the bottom line, is just a deeper understanding and a more compassionate understanding of things that I didn't understand before, and to, you know, somehow, if I can, contribute to the reduction of suffering, then maybe, right?
Yeah, dedication is really a very precious and wonderful word. I think it might be also the only meaning for the so-called living spaces. I mean, if we are alive, and then what would you do? You know, and dedication might be really the only thing we can do in our life. Yeah.
Dedication is an incredibly important principle, and you know, it's an act of generosity, and it's giving away, but it's also letting go. So once you dedicate something, it's gone. So that's a wonderful practice of presence as well. So you don't cling to your own projects, whatever good thing you did, you just gave away. You're not holding on to it, and you're putting it to service of the world.
Hi, I have a question about material. What I've noticed this morning and in this panel is that the translation of Dharma often veers towards sound and towards performance. I was speaking to a musician last week asking, like, why is it if I do live sculpture in this space, it looks embarrassing, but if a group of musicians set up and play in the desert or something, it works. And she said that music is a liquid, and it fills a space like no other medium. So my question is, I struggle with the question of how to translate Dharma into more tangible material forms. And I'm wondering, maybe this is related to what Oliver was saying about communing with the non-human. So I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts on those sort of material translations in your own practices.
Thanks for bringing that up. It was so great to see Charwei, you know, doing the Heart Sutra, because it's all about impermanence and you know, the idea of emptiness is form, form is emptiness, and that material is impermanent, and we're impermanent. So I mean, sound obviously has its own impermanence, but working with materials, there's something very, very lovely about seeing things fall apart and decay and also change. Like in the kind of work I do, you know, these kind of botanical interventions. You set up some sort of scaffold of plants and people to take care of them, and you know, you have this idea, but then things sort of have their own ideas and start to evolve, and you know, the process of succession, you know, like the alder trees eventually give way to the Douglas firs and so forth, right? There's these processes, and you working with that is working with impermanence, but there's a sort of larger intelligence of the universe that goes beyond the practitioner. So I'm really fascinated by the sort of deep time nature of material too, like what happens. I mean, plastic, you know, I've been doing a lot of work with plastic lately, and it is almost like this strange reminder of impermanence, because now we all have plastic inside us from you know, all the plastic we've thrown away. But you know, we had this idea that it was going to be permanent. You know, we would have a bag that would stay a bag, but it doesn't stay a bag. It becomes a microplastic and gets lodged in our lungs. You know, so this idea that this impermanence, and we're sort of our own. The material conditions in which we exist are also constantly in flux, and you know, kind of what goes around comes around. So I'm fascinated by the material impermanence, and particularly of the Anthropocene, right? So, and then how do we as practitioners relate to material? And then you were talking about Timothy Morton, right? And this idea of material having agency itself, like that oil, you know, you could think about oil as material that has engineered extinction, right? So oil comes from extinct fauna, and oil's job is to make more things go extinct. So, and it's doing very well. So, from the subjectivity of oil, mass extinction is a good thing because you get more oil, right? So, sort of a bad paraphrasing of Timothy Morton, but you know, you can think of any material. What would it be like to be this material and you know, want more of itself?
I have a secret love of paintings. I mean, it's a very passionate love, actually. I don't paint and I don't make paintings, but I love looking at them. And I'm reminded of Kelsang actually yesterday talking about Thangka painting. And, you know, Thangka is an incredible lineage in history in Tibetan Buddhism, and it had a very powerful function of transmission and teaching for people. And I have a tremendous respect for that form. And I also have a tremendous respect for the work of westernizing the form. But the point of iconographic paintings around spirituality is they're pedagogical largely, but they're also inspirational. So I would hate to see, you know, so to come to back, Shamir, to what you're saying, I really have huge respect for visual art makers, and you know, and it's a form of communication, and it's a very important one and a very innovative one. So that's, I guess, all I want to say.
Thanks. I'm Wiluya. I'm not a Buddhist. However, I do have a practice which brings me to that same point of silence, which I'm constantly trying to be present with. Now, I'm finding your panel inspirational, both art-wise and discussion-wise. And I'd like to bring up something which for me would be a point of social action. There's a little bit of, not with yourselves, but on the table there are bottles of water, and I find this a bit paradoxical and hypocritical. And what Oliver had to say gave me an introduction to this. I'm hoping that I can find some artistic way of expressing that, but really it's quite for the university art department to be serving water in bottles. You probably understand what I'm saying, so I don't have to carry on until I find an artistic way of showing it. How would any of you go about expressing that notion with your art practice? You know, the environmental degradation and pollution of the oceans, for instance, with the water, rather than serving it in glasses with a water some other way. Thank you.
Right. So stuff happens. It's not good for the environment. We're all partaking in it.
Yeah.
Are you listening to this conversation?
Why don't you start?
I'm trying.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes. I don't know where to go with this, except I totally agree with you. I think plastic is an enormous issue, right? It's killing our oceans. I think we're well aware of that. And yet there are contradictions, and we're all partaking in consumer culture, and I think it's a bit of a process, and the awareness is coming for all of us, but I think we have to be kind to each other when we make mistakes, or we have lapses.
To me, it's not so much about mistakes. It's that if we can't consider that in an art department at the university, how is it going to be considered in the rest of the world? It just seems that some of the places where I go, for instance, everything is thrown into the garbage that is clearly marked organics or recycling, even here at the university. So what I'm thinking is there are places in society which should be ahead of the curve, and yet they don't bother. Well, that's all I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. And this is something, as you mentioned, the contradictions are everywhere, but also I think there's a meta narrative here. Like, I mean, not only I'm not drinking out of that bottle, but I flew here from New York, right? So I'm killing the planet many times more severely than had I touched my lips to that bottle. So, but there are individual choices, right? And they're very important. And the problem is, because I work at a design school, there are design problems. Like, there's a sort of, like, why are there, with water, there are now choices, and a lot of, public buildings are providing, water bottle filling stations and stuff. We're getting there. But so much of our choices have been reduced by the sort of violent, capitalist system that we live in, so that we have to do the wrong thing. We have shitty public transit, so we have to drive, We don't have high-speed railway, so that I couldn't come here by train without it taking, 6 weeks or whatever long Amtrak would take, I'd probably be hitchhiking, between Chicago and, Des Moines to kind of make it here, because the train would have derailed or something. So things are so dysfunctional, and yet we blame ourselves, which is actually the strategy of the market system, to say it's your fault the planet's dying. So this is why we need to think of collectivity and community and sangha and relationships to overcome the oppression that we're being sort of, suffering from. So I totally hear you, but I think it's a mistake to over-individualize, our agency, and say no, collectively we've been failed, and so this is where things like political action come in. So yes, but let's look at the big picture also, and let's change why Nestle's even has access to our aquifers, let alone the plastic bottles, but thanks so much for bringing that up. I really do appreciate that. No, she's not, unfortunately. Yeah, she would remember you, and I remember you too. Yeah. No, she's not here.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Hi. I'm just kind of interested in the phenomena of Buddhism coming into the West as meditation practice, and I think on your panel you're talking about it as an ethical practice. So kind of how maybe your own experience or how you see that in the culture in the West, as often we just have images of people meditating, and that's what we think of as Buddhism. And I think what you're pointing to is more some of the things that Buddha pointed to, practices of generosity, dedication, and so on.
Just maybe repeat the question too, so everybody can hear it.
Susan, I think your question is, we've been discussing engaged Buddhism and ethics in the Buddhist teachings, but you're asking how meditation functions in the West as well?
I think still seen as meditation practice, so how could ethics be more foregrounded in a way?
I see what you're saying. Okay. Do you want me to keep? She's asking how. Anyway, let's see if I can answer this. I think there are multiple. There's many Buddhist practices in the West. There's not one, right? And I think that it goes all the way from mindfulness in a very kind of not secular kind of space, mindfulness practices that's been happening for decades now in North America, all the way to sanghas with rinpoches and gurus, Tibetan gurus, and who are leading systematic stages of practice as taught in traditional Tibet or traditional systems of thought. So I don't think there's one approach here. I think there's been multiple approaches, and I think it's great people are meditating. I think it's great mindfulness is being highlighted, and I think everybody needs it. This is good for everybody. It's good for children. They're doing it in schools. It doesn't matter. All of us need to calm our minds because we're all overwhelmed. Human beings are completely overwhelmed. So this is a good thing. And the other second part of your question was about how the ethical side of the teachings can come forward in Engaged Buddhism. And I think that happens through study, personally. I think reading, there are places where you can go and you can do it on your own, absolutely. Just study the Dharma. Study it. And if you start at the beginning, Buddha started with ethics. In the first teachings that they say that the Buddha's first teachings involved ethics because 2,500 years ago sounds a lot like it is right now. A lot of really intense, disturbing minds, a lot of violence. People were killing each other. People were lying. People were stealing. It sounds familiar, right? We recognize this society, It wasn't any different in Buddhist time. So when Buddha started teaching, the only sole purpose of the Buddhist teachings was to relieve beings' suffering. That was the sole purpose of all the teachings. But in order to do that in the beginning, ethics needed to be addressed because there was a lot of harmful negative action happening. And so that's why you have your whole big monastic codes of do's and don'ts. All the behavioral stuff that came up in early Buddhism was to stop people from doing negative actions of body, speech, and mind. And you need to stop that and pacify that before you can go on to more advanced Buddhist practices, actually. Because that second noble truth, the cause of suffering, is exactly that. It's ignorance, it's desire and aggression, which are out of control. And I think that's what we see in our own society right now in North America, certainly, are those three: ignorance, aggression, and desire in their extreme forms, causing tremendous negativity and suffering. So I think for myself, I learned that by studying the sutras, studying the history, studying. I found that information is available to everybody.
Bravo for that. That's the one thing I wanted to maybe unpack was that there's a tendency to the sort of take the activism or the ethics out of practice. This is happening. And there was an article recently in The Guardian about the Mindfulness Conspiracy, which some of you might have read, where mindfulness is a big business now in Silicon Valley, and it enables people. There's a lot of people who are teaching tech bros to meditate in order so they can be more efficient capitalists, so they can be get up earlier in the morning and sort of monetize their time and sort of basically become kind of more machinic. And feel better about what they're doing and be more focused at work. Okay, so that's what happens when you take the ethics out of practice, right? So the meditation without the ethics is kind of like half the picture. It's certainly a good thing to have meditation as a skill. It's certainly healthy, and there's many benefits to the mental and physical health. But the ethics is really what I couldn't live without that. But people do, and the tendency in capitalism is to subsume everything, including meditation. So it's now become a business to get people, it's like getting a massage or, something that's good for you, but it's not necessarily helping the world, right? So I'm very worried about that, but it is a thing that is now a trend.
I guess that's time is up, if that's grammar. But thank you so much for your energy and presence, and thanks to our panelists. Thanks to Hama as well. Thank you.
So thank you all so much. Wow, this is really loud. Thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. We're going to be moving across the campus to the Hickman building for the closing keynote by Suzanne Lacey and Jodie Evans. So if you'd like to make your way across, I think there will be people who will be able to show you the way if you don't know your way across campus. So maybe Regan, Janelle, Ebony, there are a bunch of folks at the back waving their hands who'll be able to take you across. And I think Michael Zhang is also finishing his artwork in the hallway. So if anybody would like to just watch him conclude, that would be fantastic as well. We've got a little bit of time, so take your time and we'll wander across. Thank you very much.